Welcome to a truly boring history, a soft-spoken journey through the forgotten corners of the past. Tonight, we quietly step into the smoke and silence of a life spent beside the forge. This won't be a tale of triumph or glory, but of cracked hands, burning lungs, and a job that slowly wore you down day after day. If you're just settling in for a peaceful listen before sleep, we'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Feel free to leave a comment and say hello. In this story, we follow the quiet and brutal life of a medieval blacksmith, a man whose world was fire, iron, and exhaustion. A man who carried the weight of a village on his shoulders, and who slowly gave more of himself to the forge than he ever meant to. Not all deaths come in battle. Some come with silence, soot, and the sound of a hammer falling one last time. So settle in. Let the past be heavy, and the fire be low. This is a truly boring history. Before you ever held a hammer, you carried the weight of one. Not in your hand, but in your back. In your legs. In your breath. As a boy, your day began not with sparks and steel, but with buckets, heavy, sloshing, sooty buckets. Water from the well. Coal from the cart. Ash from yesterday's forge. Your hands weren't yet calloused, but your shoulders already sagged. You didn't yet know the feel of iron, but you knew what it meant to carry something that didn't want to be carried. You weren't born to the forge. No one was. But some were born too close to it to escape. Your father was a blacksmith. And his father before him. The tools in the workshop didn't feel like objects. They felt like relatives. The hammer had a name. The anvil had a dent shaped like his thumb. The bellows breathed like lungs. The fire, always there, was less a hazard than a companion. You didn't understand it, but you learned to fear it, not for its burn, but for its hunger. They didn't tell you you'd be a blacksmith. No one had to. It was assumed. Spoken in glances, in gestures, in how your mother scraped soot from your ears before supper. You didn't play with wooden swords like the others. You polished the real ones under supervision, in silence. You wiped them with cloth too coarse for your skin. Sometimes they were still warm. Sometimes they were stained with something darker than rust. You never asked. By the time you were strong enough to swing the hammer, you no longer thought of it as a choice. The forge already knew you. It greeted you with its thick breath, coated your lungs in its black dust, wrapped your hair in its oily scent. You'd watched your father limp in the mornings, one ankle dragging slightly from a misstep decades ago. You thought it normal. You thought it was just what men became. The first time you struck hot iron, it screamed. Not a high-pitched cry, but a deep, sharp hiss that felt personal. The metal resisted. It bent only under violence. And you learned quickly that shaping anything required force. Not careful shaping, not gentle nudging, but power. The kind that made your wrist ache after 2 strikes. The kind that splintered your grip and rattled your bones. You missed a few times. Everyone did. The anvil didn't forgive. Neither did your knuckles. The noise of the forge was constant. Hammer to steel. Bellows to flame. The hiss of water when the work was done. You grew used to it. And then you couldn't live without it. Silence became suspicious. It meant something was broken. Or worse, something was waiting. Your ears rang at night. You couldn't hear the wind anymore. Just echoes of labor. The anvil sat in the center of the room like a god. Immovable, heavy, judging. You walked around it the way you walked around your father when he was angry, carefully. It bore the scars of generations, and you were told never to file it smooth. It remembers, your father once said, not looking up. You didn't ask what it remembered. You figured it was the same thing your body would, in time. Your back hurt before you turned 16. Your palms split in winter. Your sleep was shallow. But no one spoke of pain. Pain was like heat. It was always there. It wasn't something to complain about, only something to survive. You weren't yet the blacksmith. But you were already burning. Not visibly. Not from fire. But from the slow, steady weight of being shaped. Not unlike the iron you were expected to master. Bent over the anvil. Heated in the forge. Cooled in the dark water beside the coals. And somewhere in the middle of all that, between breath and blister, you realized the truth no one ever said aloud. The work would always shape you more than you shaped it. You never lit the forge from nothing. It was never truly cold. Even when the shutters were shut tight against snow, even when frost hung from the rafters and your breath came out in clouds, the fire inside the forge still lived. Not bright, not roaring, just enough, deep beneath the ash, a patient glow waiting to be fed. It was always hungry. And you, half asleep in the dark before dawn, were always the first to feed it. The ritual was simple but sacred. You cleared yesterday's bones of coal and sifted through the soot for the pulse of embers still alive. Then the kindling, thin slivers of scrap, shaved by hand and dried in cloth. A slow breath from the bellows. Not too much, not too fast. The fire didn't like to be startled. It grew with coaxing, with respect. And once it stirred, once the glow became orange and the orange turned to flame, you stepped back. The heat came suddenly, like being shouted at by something older than language. There were days when the forge felt like the only thing awake in the village. Before roosters, before bells, before footfall. You'd open the doors just enough to let the smoke crawl out, and the village would still be sleeping, unaware of the fire being born again behind your walls. But that was the life of the smith. The first to wake, the last to rest, your heartbeat borrowed from something burning beside you. The forge had moods. Some days it flared too quickly, angry at the damp in the wood or the damp in your breath. Other days it refused to rise, no matter how hard you pumped, as if punishing you for your weariness. But most days, it welcomed you with a steady rhythm, the bellows and the flame breathing together, like two lungs inside a giant invisible beast. And when it was right, when the coals turned white and the flame licked low, you could feel it not just in the room but in your skin. Like being watched. Like being claimed. You didn't wear gloves. No blacksmith did. They got in the way. You used rags when you had them, but mostly it was your bare hands that faced the heat. They blistered. Correct. Sometimes the skin came away like paper. You learned not to flinch. You learned to dip your burns in water, not for healing but to hear the sizzle. It told you were still part of the forge. Still hot enough to matter. When the work began, shaping hinges, arrowheads, horseshoes, you moved with the rhythm of the flame. Too slow, and the metal cooled. Too fast, and it folded wrong. The hammer wasn't just a tool, it was an extension of the fire. Every blow had to land while the heat still sang in the iron. It was timing, instinct, a kind of music played with your whole body. The wrong note, and something snapped. Some days you worked without speaking a word. The fire did all the talking. It crackled in judgment. It whispered in bursts of smoke. You could read its mood from how it moved, too blue, too high, too quiet. It told you what it wanted. And if you listened, it rewarded you with metal that bent like dough. If you didn't, it punished you with shards, sparks, and wasted hours. You came to understand why old blacksmiths had that stare. The faraway one. Not because they were tired, though they were, but because their minds were always half in the fire. Even in sleep, they saw the flicker behind their eyelids. They smelled smoke when there was none. They could name a temperature by the color of steel, the pitch of the hiss when it hit the quench bucket. And still, the fire was never yours. It belonged to the forge, to the building, to the lineage. You only served it, day after day, season after season, until your hands forgot what cool stone felt like, until the inside of your nose was lined with charcoal, until your voice dropped an octave, not from age, but from breathing smoke. And when others feared the cold, you envied them. You couldn't feel winter anymore. Not the way they did. You only felt the absence of heat. You dressed the same in frost as you did in summer. Because for you, there was only the fire. The one that never truly went out. The one that waited even now, beneath the ashes of your sleep, whispering, "Begin again." The hammer was the first to betray you. Not because it broke in your hand. No, the hammer was loyal in that way, but because it changed your body before you understood the cost. Its weight seemed manageable at first, solid and familiar, a companion shaped for your grip. But repetition revealed the truth. The handle grew heavier not with age, but with expectation. Each strike it delivered rippled back through your arm, down to the spine, like a message you were never meant to ignore. You didn't strike metal once or twice in a day. You struck it hundreds of times. Thousands on the worst days. Not all with full force, but enough to shake your elbow loose over years. You'd feel it first as a tightness, then a throb, then a numbness that settled in your wrist like something permanent. Some men switched arms. Most didn't, not because they couldn't, but because the left never struck the way the right did. And the iron knew the difference. Other tools followed. The tongs, twisted and blackened, demanded strength in strange ways. They forced your hands to remain open when your muscles begged to close. They bit your fingers if your grip faltered. They burned you if you hesitated. One slip of a hot horseshoe, one careless moment lifting a red glowing blade, and you'd lose more than just skin. You'd lose rhythm. And in this work, rhythm was everything. Then came the chisels. Sharp at first, precise, elegant. But they dulled faster than you could keep up. You'd hone them on stones worn slick with years of sharpening, but eventually, the iron lost its bite. And yet, you had to keep using them. A dull chisel required more force, more control. It was ironic. When the tools failed, it wasn't the metal that suffered first. It was your body, asked to make up the difference. The bellows were perhaps the most deceptive of all. They looked simple. Leather stretched over wood, creaking like tired lungs. But they required timing, coordination, and relentless effort. If you pumped too fast, the fire choked. Too slow, and it died. You had to keep a rhythm that had nothing to do with your breath and everything to do with the fires. You became its second set of lungs. And when your back ached from leaning, when your knees locked from kneeling too long, you couldn't stop. The fire didn't care that your body rebelled. The fire only knew hunger. The tools didn't break all at once. Neither did you. They wore you down in silence. One finger lost its range. One shoulder refused to lift past a certain point. Your neck stiffened in winter. Your fingers curled even when you tried to stretch them. You told yourself it was part of the job. That the pain was a tax you paid to make something useful, something lasting. And yet, everything you made lasted longer than you. You watched the older smiths, men who moved like statues, whose joints cracked like logs in a hearth. You noticed how they wrapped their wrists before they worked, how they grimaced when lifting something that used to feel light. They didn't complain. They didn't speak about it. But you saw it in how they stared at their tools, like staring at an old friend who'd forgotten your name. The forge was full of tools. Hammers, punches, drifts, files, swages, hardy tools wedged in anvils like teeth. Each had a purpose. Each took a part of you in return. Not visibly, not all at once, but in quiet, cumulative ways. And no one warned you that the hardest thing wasn't learning to use them, it was learning to live with what they did to you. Some men left the trade before it claimed too much. Most didn't, not because they loved it, but because it was all they knew. You didn't train to be a blacksmith. You became one slowly, painfully, through a long surrender to the work, to the tools, to the things they asked of your bones. And so, every time you picked up a hammer, you remembered. Not the lessons, not the successes, but the cost. You remembered that for every nail made, every shoe shaped, every blade drawn from flame, something else was taken from you. Something you couldn't sharpen. Something you couldn't forge anew. It didn't start as choking. It started as smell. The kind that clung to your clothes long after you'd left the forge, buried itself into your hair, settled in the crease of your elbows, your collar, the space behind your ears. Smoke, but not the kind that rose gently from a fire at night. This was thick, greasy, alive. It moved like a beast through the rafters and hugged the beams like old rope. You breathed it in without noticing, because you always had. No one warned you what it would do. At first, it made your eyes sting. You wiped them with your sleeve and kept working. Then it made your throat dry. You drank water from the bucket meant for quenching steel. But after a few years, the cough came. Not hard, not sharp, just there. Constant. It rumbled in your chest at dawn and lingered like a bad memory until dusk. And then came the days when the smoke didn't leave, even when you stepped outside. When your lungs still felt heavy in the cold air, and you couldn't draw a full breath without needing to pause. It was like breathing through cloth, or drowning slowly above water. You told yourself it was just fatigue, but your chest told a different story. There was no escaping it. The forge had no chimney, not a proper one. Just a hole in the wall or a crude flue, barely enough to let the worst of it drift out. The rest of the smoke circled back toward you, dancing through the sunbeams that cut across the soot-covered windows. You learned to squint through the haze. You learned to recognize the difference between clean fire and choking fire. Between wood that burned clean and charcoal that smothered you with every spark. But even the best fire left its mark. By 30, you woke up coughing. Not violently, just persistently. Your wife began to sleep further from you, not because of the sound, but because she said your breath smelled like burnt leather. You stopped noticing the smell. Not because it went away, but because it became the smell of your life. Some nights, when you sat alone after the fire died down, the air would settle like a blanket, warm but wrong. You'd open the door to let it escape, but it never truly left. It was in the walls, in your lungs, in your very blood, perhaps. A part of you now. One you didn't ask for but couldn't refuse. And you weren't alone. Every blacksmith you knew had the same cough. Some hid it. Others couldn't. One man down the road, a strong smith with shoulders like tree trunks, began spitting blood in the winter. Said it was nothing. Said it was just the cold. But he didn't survive the spring. His forge was given to his son, and the bellows still pumped while the crows circled overhead. You wondered sometimes what your lungs looked like. Not pink, surely. Maybe black like overcooked meat, or gray like ash. Maybe they were lined with soot the way your chimney was, layer after layer, thickening with every day you lived and breathed your trade. You thought about it, but not too long. Because thinking didn't cool the forge, and your hands had work to do. You tried wet cloth over your mouth. It helped, a little, but not enough. And the cloth itself became soaked with darkness, like a reminder. Eventually, you stopped trying. The work needed air. The forge needed your full breath. And the smoke came with it. In time, your voice grew softer. Not from choice, but from erosion. It cracked when you tried to raise it. It faded mid-sentence. Some men thought you were growing wise, that silence suited you. But really, the smoke had taken your voice the way it took everything else, without asking. And still you worked. Because the iron didn't care. Because the village still brought you broken blades and tired horses. Because the fire still burned, and someone had to feed it. Even if it cost you the one thing you never thought you'd lose, the breath to keep going. The heat stayed long after the fire died. It didn't need flame to keep itself alive. It lived in the stones of the forge, in the timber of the beams, in your hands, your spine, your skull. Even when the sun fell behind the hills and the anvil cooled to silence, your skin still carried the warmth like a warning. There was no such thing as rest. Only the illusion of it, wrapped in sweat-soaked linen. At night, you'd lie on the straw mattress with your shirt peeled off, chest rising slowly, listening to the quiet hiss of your own skin trying to cool. The window barely let in breeze. The walls, thick and low, held the forge's breath like a tomb. You would turn over, then turn back, never quite finding the spot where the heat didn't reach. Your dreams came slow and sour, heavy with smoke and sparks. You'd wake often, not startled, not alarmed, just aware. Too aware. And even when sleep came, it wasn't gentle. It was shallow, like resting underwater. Your body would twitch with ghost movements, the jerk of a hammer arm, the lurch of a pulled bellows, the sting of a spark landing just below the eye. You could feel them in the dark. The forge followed you, even there. Others spoke of winter as a reprieve. A chance to sleep under thick furs, to breathe cool air that didn't taste of cinders. But not you. In winter, the forge roared louder. It demanded more fuel, more work, more hours. It was the only warm place left, and so it became the heart of the home. And when you left it to sleep, the cold didn't help. Your body, used to fire, shivered like it was being punished for leaving the flame. Your bones ached from the contrast. Heat to cold, back to heat. Day after day. There were nights when you could still feel the hammer's handle in your palm long after you'd set it down. Your fingers curled involuntarily, cramped from gripping too long. You would try to straighten them, to stretch them flat against your chest. Sometimes they obeyed. Sometimes they didn't. And that, too, stole sleep. You stopped asking for comfort. Pillows were a luxury. Softness was weakness. Your wife had sewn a cover for the mattress once, filled it with feathers from a winter call, hoping it might ease your rest. But you found it too unfamiliar, too soft, like sinking into something that couldn't hold your weight. You returned to the straw. It was honest, if nothing else. Even your dreams, when they came, betrayed you. You dreamed not of fields or laughter or warm bread, but of glowing iron, twisting under your hammer, hissing in the water trough. You dreamed of sparks that flew into your beard, of customers who never paid, of tools that snapped mid-strike. And always, always, the fire. Sometimes alive. Sometimes whispering. Sometimes angry that you'd left it unattended. You'd rise before the sun, never fully rested, pulling on clothes that still smelled of the day before. And as you opened the forge door again, letting in the dawn light, you would feel the heat already reaching out to you. The embers still lived. The coals were waiting. The fire didn't sleep, and so neither did you. You no longer asked for quiet nights. You only hoped for fewer burns. And when your son asked why your eyes looked so heavy in the morning, you didn't answer. You simply lit the forge again, bellows creaking like bones, and let the fire speak for you. Iron never forgot a mistake. It held the memory of every hesitation, every miscalculated strike, every heartbeat you were too slow or too fast. Where wood could be shaved and stitched, where cloth could be patched and dyed, iron punished you for every flaw. And unlike the fire, which could sometimes be reasoned with, iron had no mood. It was indifferent. It didn't care whether your arm was tired or your back was failing. It didn't yield out of sympathy. It bent only to perfection, and it broke when you fell short. When the metal was hot, yellow-orange, glowing like a small sun, it looked almost soft. Deceptively soft. Like wax. But that was a lie. Even then, even at its most malleable, it demanded force. Not wild strikes, but ones born of rhythm and control. If you missed the right moment by even a breath, it cooled too fast. The color dimmed, the hiss quieted, and it turned stubborn again, resisting your hammer like a clenched jaw. You'd have to heat it again. And again. And with every cycle, the iron lost something. Its structure, its smoothness. And so did you. Blades were the worst. They were delicate, in a way that required your full attention. A slight warp in the middle, a slip of the wrist at the edge, and what should have been a weapon became a wasted bar. And worse, sometimes you didn't see the flaw until it was too late, after it had been quenched, after it had been polished, after a client had taken it into his hand with expectation in his eyes. That was when you had to answer for the iron's judgment. Iron cut back. Not just metaphorically. It sent shards flying like sparks when struck improperly. It split with a crack sharp enough to startle your breath. It bounced when you wanted it still and resisted when you needed it to flow. You learned, painfully, that every piece of metal had a grain, a direction, a personality. Some curved naturally. Some twisted without warning. Some were just cursed, full of invisible air or impurities, and broke under the gentlest shaping. The burns from iron were different from burns from fire. Fire was broad, blinding, dramatic. It could take your eyebrows or blister your neck in one careless lean. But iron touched you more intimately. It kissed the inside of your fingers when you forgot how close your hand was. It brushed your thigh when the tongs slipped. It branded the flesh in ways that lingered, tiny half-moon scars, dotted lines of pain, permanent fingerprints etched into your own skin. And yet you returned to it every day. Not because you loved it, but because it gave shape to your life. There was dignity in surviving something so unforgiving, in pulling form out of resistance, in proving, even for a moment, that you could master what tried to defeat you. Still, you never trusted it. You approached each bar with caution, measured the heat with your eyes, the timing with your gut, and hoped. You hoped the blade wouldn't warp. You hoped the hinge would turn true. You hoped that today would be one of the days when the iron listened. But on the days it didn't, and there were many, it humbled you without cruelty. That was the strange part. Iron didn't punish with malice. It simply reminded you of reality. That strength alone was not enough. That effort didn't guarantee outcome. That mastery was never permanent. And so you learned not to expect gratitude from it. The sword you made would not remember you. The plow you shaped would not speak of your labor. The horseshoe nailed into a hoof would not thank you for its even curve. But they would outlast you. That much you understood. Your body would fail long before the iron you shaped did. Your grave might rust. Your tools might be passed to another. But the work, the objects, the pieces, the weight of your effort would remain. Silent, solid, unforgiving. No one thanked you for the nails. They were too small to notice, too ordinary to admire. They vanished into doors, carts, shutters, boots, forgotten as soon as they were hammered into place. But you made them by the hundreds. Some days by the thousands. Each one forged by hand, each one an echo of a motion you repeated until your wrist throbbed and your knuckles swelled. No other work felt so repetitive, so invisible, and yet so essential. Without those nails, the village fell apart. Literally. Gates sagged, carts collapsed, roofs blew open in the night wind. Yet when villagers brought you requests, they rarely asked for nails by name. "I need a hinge," they'd say, or "My wagon bed's come loose again." And you'd make them what they needed, plus the nails to hold it all together, without ceremony or charge. Because it was understood. Nails weren't the product. They were the expectation beneath the product. Making them required less brute force, but more attention. A mistake in a blade could be reshaped. A bad nail had to be scrapped. Too thin bent. Too thick it split the wood. The heads had to be flattened just enough to hold, but not so wide they cracked whatever they were driven into. You struck the rod quickly, heat, strike, clip, flatten. The rhythm didn't vary. If it did, the nail failed. At the height of your skill, your hands could make them without your eyes. Your ears listened to the sizzle of the metal, your palms felt the shape through the tongs, your body timed the strikes. You'd fill a bucket in an afternoon, the sound of each finished nail echoing as it dropped in with its brothers. A sound no one else noticed. But to you, it was a kind of music. Some nails you never saw again. Others returned to you years later, bent from a broken beam or rusted from a flood. You'd pull them free with your claw hammer, examine them, remember the day you forged them. Not with sentiment, blacksmiths didn't afford that, but with recognition. As if nodding to an old laboring companion, both of you worse for wear. The church bell tower stayed up because of your nails. The inn's floorboards held firm through seasons of wet boots and spilt ale because of your nails. The carts that delivered grain, the fences that penned livestock, the handles on coffins, they all relied on iron you shaped in quiet, unnoticed hours. And still, the people who came to your forge spoke more of swords, of shields, of nails. They said little. Even though the nails were in everything. It wasn't glory you sought. By now, you understood the work had no glory. But some days, when your hands bled from sharp corners, when your shoulders refused to lift the next rod, you wondered what it meant to spend a life making things that disappeared inside other things. But you kept making them, because no one else would. Because the carpenter's chisel meant nothing without your iron to fasten his boards. Because the door that kept out wolves and wind relied on your small, perfect pieces of labor. Because even if no one remembered the hand that forged the nail, they still lived in houses that stood because of them. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The knock on the forge door came early, always before you had drawn your first breath of smoke or warmed the bellows with your hands. A farmer stood there, cap in hand, eyes lowered, boots caked in mud and expectation. He needed something fixed, or made, or replaced. The blade of his scythe had cracked. His plowshare was dull. His hinges no longer held his barn door in the wind. He had come not with coin, but with the weight of familiarity. You knew him. Not by name, perhaps, but by routine. The villagers all did this. They came needing something essential, something only iron could solve. And they came empty-handed. They would mumble apologies, offer promises. "I'll bring a sack of barley next week," or "My wife makes fine cheese. I'll bring some once it's ready." You nodded, not because you believed them, but because refusing didn't stop the need. And the work itself could not be delayed. If you didn't fix the plow, his field would go unturned. If the gate remained broken, his animals would stray. And then come winter, both of you would starve. Sometimes, the payment came as they promised. A few eggs. A slice of smoked meat. Once, a blanket stitched with more hope than skill. But more often than not, it never came at all. They forgot. Or they couldn't spare it. Or they assumed it didn't matter, Because you always kept the fire burning. Always answered the door. Always helped. There were days when you looked at the list of pending work and saw not jobs, but debts. Invisible, quiet debts that piled like ash in your ledger. Not owed in money, not repaid in kind, but they're all the same. A sword for the Reeves' son, polished and sharpened, delivered with a bow, no coin. A dozen nails for the Thatcher's new roof, no coin. A horseshoe for the priest's mare, forged with care so it wouldn't limp again, no coin. The noblemen were no better. They arrived with guards and soft words, complimented your craft, examined your weapons like connoisseurs of violence. They asked for ornate blades, intricate hinges, or branding irons with family crests. When they left, they often forgot to mention payment at all. And you did not dare to ask. You knew what it meant to ask a man with a sword on his hip and a name that reached the king's ear. You tried keeping track once, scratching marks onto the forge wall. A line for every unpaid order. By midsummer, the wall was full. You washed it clean before winter. Not because it no longer mattered, but because looking at it made the fire seem colder. Some apprentices asked you why you didn't demand coin first. Why you didn't charge more. Why you didn't lock the door when they came with only stories. You didn't answer them. How could you explain the quiet contract you had with the village? They needed you. And you, stubborn as rust, needed to be needed. So you worked. You folded steel into scythe blades for men who would forget your name. You made hinges for cradles that would never know you helped keep them safe. You hammered the shape of survival into iron and let it walk away in someone else's hands. The fire still burned. The hammer still rose. The work still got done. But the purse remained light. And your stomach, some nights, too. It happened without warning. One morning, as you bent over the forge, ready to draw breath into the coals, the bellows let out a strangled gasp and then fell silent. No puff, no wind, no breath. Just the creak of dry leather collapsing inward and the hollow thud of effort wasted. You pulled again, slower, hoping it was a slip, a trick of the wood. But the sound was the same, airless, broken. The forge did not answer. You stared at it like you might stare at a wounded animal. The bellows had been with you longer than your apprentice. Older than your eldest son. You had patched it countless times. Stitched the seams, oiled the leather, reinforced the handles when the grip wore smooth. It had breathed life into fire through frost, through rain, through the aching summer. And now it simply refused. There was no quick fix. No strip of hide nearby, no spare plank shaved to size. Replacing a bellows was a task in itself, an expensive one and slow. The kind of work done over winter, not in the thick of need. But you couldn't wait. The forge demanded breath. And without it your day stood still. You tried to stoke the coals by hand, blowing through hollow reed, fanning with cloth, anything to coax the embers into life. But it wasn't enough. The heat flickered, then died. The iron cooled in place. Your hands, still dirty from yesterday, shook from the sudden stillness. It wasn't just the forge that had stopped. It was you. You hadn't realized how much you depended on it, not just for work, but for rhythm, for routine, for noise. The bellows had always given you something steady, something certain. The sound of it rising and falling was like a second heartbeat in the shop. Now, there was only silence. And in that silence, the weight of everything else rushed in. You sat on the stool and looked at your hands. Calloused, blistered, blackened. They hovered useless in your lap. There was no hammering to do. No steel to shape. Just a broken tool and the knowledge that you couldn't fix it alone. The boy offered to run for leather. You nodded, though you knew it wouldn't be enough. The kind you needed was rare, expensive, and distant. You could trade, perhaps, if someone still owed you. And they did. They all did. But asking now, when you had nothing to give, felt like begging. And pride, for all it had cost you, was one thing you hadn't yet surrendered. The rest of the day you spent in fragments, mending smaller tools, sweeping soot, pretending you were busy. But the truth was, you were waiting. Waiting for the air to return. Waiting for motion. Waiting to be needed again. And as night fell, you looked at the forge, not cold, exactly, but quiet. And used. And that stillness unnerved you. It wasn't just the bellows that had broken. It was the breath of the work itself, the part that made you feel alive, the part that gave shape to the hours and meaning to the pain. For a blacksmith, silence is not peace. It is absence. It is the sound of purpose fading into memory. You closed the shop doors slowly that night, not with exhaustion, but with something heavier, something closer to grief. He came to you when he was barely more than a child, too thin for the tongs, too soft for the noise, too eager in the way only those who don't understand the work can be. He had no scars yet, no burn marks on his wrists, no instinct to flinch when the forge snapped smoke in his face. He called you master, at first, then sir, then, eventually, nothing at all. Just a look in the morning, a quiet nod, and the work began. He asked questions. Endless ones. Why did you hit the metal at that angle? Why did some iron spark blue and some red? Why did the fire sometimes sing and sometimes sulk? You tried to answer at first. Tried to explain the difference between steel that rang and steel that whispered. But words never truly taught the craft. It had to be felt, through pain, through time, through repetition. He learned quickly. Not perfectly, but well enough. His hands were clumsy, but strong. His eyes were good, sharp, steady. He made mistakes, and you let him. Not out of cruelty, but because failure is a better teacher than praise. He burned himself often. Cursed under his breath. Hit the blisters. You saw them anyway. What surprised you wasn't how he learned, but how he watched. Not just the metal or the fire, but your walk. Your grip. The way your shoulders sagged more on rainy days. The way you took longer now to lift the hammer. The way your breath rattled in the morning, even before the forge did. He said nothing, but he saw it all. One evening he finished early. You were still shaping a horseshoe, slower than you used to. He didn't leave. He cleaned the shop around you, swept the floor, gathered the tools, stacked the scraps. You told him to go. He said nothing. Just waited. But not the metal. You began to notice it more after that. The way he stood closer when you lifted something heavy. The way he reached for the bellows before you did. The way he quietly corrected a measurement you'd misjudged, then pretended he hadn't. He wasn't just learning the work. He was learning how the work was wearing you down. You resented him for it, briefly. Not because he helped, but because he reminded you of what you used to be. Of how long you had done this. Of how many years had been ground into the grooves of your tools. But that resentment passed, as all heat does. What remained was something colder, quieter, the realization that he was waiting. Not for you to teach him more, but for the forge to become his. You didn't speak of it. Not then. Not later. But each day he did more. Took over the hammering. Managed the bellows without instruction. Made nails without complaint. You watched his back broaden, his voice deepen, his arms darken with soot and strength. And you felt your own body dim in response. Still, you rose each morning. Still, you struck the iron. But the fire no longer needed you the same way. And he knew it. And in time, so did you. It was never just about the money. If it were, you'd have quit long ago, found softer labor, cleaner work, anything with fewer burns and more silver. But still, the coins mattered. You didn't swing the hammer for pride alone. You did it so there would be bread on the table, meat once a week, oil for the lamp, shoes that didn't split open after a single rain. And yet, over and over again, the coin never came. They promised it. Boys. Next week. When the harvest sells. After the tax collector's been paid. They came with bowed heads, with wide smiles, with stories. You didn't believe most of them, but you listened anyway. And you worked. You shaped their nails, repaired their plows, straightened their bent blades. You did it quickly, cleanly, and without complaint. Because that was the way. Because your forge had to be open. Because their lives ran through your hands, even if their gratitude didn't. Some brought you coin, yes, but often too little, too late. And always with an apology. A few copper pieces when the job was worth silver. A handful of foreign coins that no local merchant would accept. Once, a child brought you a single polished rock, saying it was from his mother, who swore it was lucky. You kept it, not for luck, but because it was honest. More honest than most of the words that passed for payment. You knew better than to chase them. You didn't leave your forge to knock on doors, to remind men of debts they already knew they owed. It wouldn't help. It would shame them, and shame had never bought bread. Besides, you couldn't spare the time. There was always something to do, something to fix, something to heat, something to shape. You learned to stretch what you had. A stew from bones. A cloak from patches. A smile that said, "I'm fine," when your ribs said otherwise. The work never stopped, and neither did you. Hunger became a shadow, not always visible, but always just behind you. There were weeks you sold your own tools just to keep going. An old file, a spare pair of tongs, a punch you hadn't used in months. You told yourself you didn't need them. And maybe you didn't. Not right then. But later, when the job required it, you'd curse the empty space on the wall and wonder if it had been worth it, for one more meal, one more week. And yet, the forge stayed open. Because closing it meant admitting something had broken that couldn't be mended. Because as long as the fire burned, there was still hope. That someone would pay. That someone would bring coin, not excuses. That someone would value your time. But most days, they didn't. And so, the coin remained an idea. A promise in the distance. A ghost that circled the edges of your labor. You'd hear it in the clink of tools, in the rhythm of hammer strikes, in the hopeful jingle of a pouch that too often turned out to be empty. But still you worked. Because a smith without fire is just another man with black hands. And a man without coin is just a little hungrier than yesterday. You heard it long after the forge had gone cold. Not in the shop, not in the wind, but in your sleep, soft, steady, impossible. The ringing of iron. A faint metallic chime that echoed through your skull like a lullaby forged in fire. You would lie still on the straw mat, eyes shut, and still it would come. The phantom rhythm of hammer on steel, the high-pitched ting that never quite faded. At first, you thought it was memory. Just the brain playing tricks after too many hours at the anvil. But it persisted. Night after night, it slipped into your ears, as if the forge had taken residence inside your head, refusing to let you go even in rest. You tried sleeping deeper, heavier, burning yourself out with labor. Lifting more, striking faster, working through supper until your body gave out. But the moment your eyes shut, there it was. The ring. A single note. Clear, so, honest. It wasn't unpleasant, not exactly. But it was invasive. You couldn't dream without it. Even the simplest visions, fields, rivers, laughter, were haunted by its backdrop. Every imagined place echoed with a smith's work. Your work. Sometimes, you wondered if it had always been there, just quieter. Hidden behind your youth, your hunger, your aching muscles. But now, with age curling into your spine and sleep becoming more fragile, the sound had room to rise. Your wife noticed. She said you twitched in your sleep, your hands curling as if around tongs. Once, you mumbled to no one, asking for a bar of iron. Another time, you barked, "Hold it steady," so sharply it startled her from her dreams. The boy, your apprentice, asked why you sometimes dozed off sitting upright. You didn't explain. What would you say? That the forge never truly let go? That even rest was just another version of work? On some nights, the sound grew louder. Not deafening, but fuller. You heard not just one hammer, but many. As if 100 forges were working in unison, far off across a valley. Each note a call. Each strike a heartbeat. You wondered if that's what death would be like. Not silence, but metal. Not peace, but rhythm. And sometimes, between the sounds, you thought you heard voices. Men shouting, breathing, laughing. The voices of smiths long gone. The ones who had worked the fire before you, the ones who had burned their hands and cracked their bones and faded into soot. Maybe they, too, still heard the iron in their sleep. You tried blocking it out. Stuffing rags in your ears. Drinking more ale before bed. But it didn't help. The sound wasn't in your ears. It was behind them. Deeper. Settled into the part of you that no tool could reach. There were moments, fleeting, silent moments, when you thought the sound had stopped. When you lay in perfect stillness, and the only thing you heard was the wind outside and your own breath. But those moments were rare. And they never lasted. Because you were a blacksmith. And iron remembers its maker. Even in sleep. There were mornings when you feared it wouldn't catch. When you crouched by the hearth with the tinder dry and the kindling ready, and still, nothing. You struck the flint, once, twice, again. Sparks danced, but the coals stayed black, as if mocking your effort. You whispered to it like a lover who'd grown distant. "Come now. Just a little." But the fire didn't answer. It was the same fire you'd lit 1,000 times before, and yet it acted like a stranger. The bellows wheezed. The dry straw crumbled under your fingers. The ash from yesterday stirred but gave no warmth. You checked the wood. Good, dry oak. You fanned the spark until your fingers stung from the cold. Still, the fire refused. You began to sweat from something colder than labor. Because without fire, the forge was just a cold box of iron and stone. And you were just a man with no purpose. The boy stood behind you, quiet, watching. He didn't offer to take over. He knew better. This was not a task you could hand off. It wasn't just a chore, it was a ritual. You needed to win the flame. You began again. Slower. More careful. Less desperate. You laid the shavings in a new shape, built the wood like a cradle, spoke to it under your breath. When the spark came, this time, it held. Not much, just a breath of orange. But it grew, flickered, stretched upward like it had finally remembered who you were. Only then did your shoulders ease. Only then did you breathe. But that morning stayed with you. Because it wasn't just about kindling. It was about what it meant for the fire to resist you. What it meant for your hands to fail at the one thing they'd always done. You hadn't changed your method. You hadn't made a mistake. And still it had turned its back on you. You remembered a story an old smith once told you. How when a man grew too old, the fire could smell it. It knew when your strength was fading. And it would test you to see if you were still worthy of heat. You laughed at the story when you first heard it. But now you weren't so sure. That day you worked slower. Not because your body demanded it, but because the flame had reminded you how fragile it all was. How the heat didn't belong to you, it merely agreed to come, for a time. You caught yourself watching the fire more than usual. Studying its shape, the way it licked the edge of the iron, the way it breathed with the bellows. You'd always known how to control it. But now you wondered if you had only ever borrowed it. When you closed the forge that night, the fire still glowed, steady and warm. But you didn't trust it. Not fully. Not anymore. And the next morning, when you went to light it again, your hands moved a little slower. Just in case. It had never moved before. Not in all the years you'd worked that patch of earth. The anvil, solid, sullen, unmoving, had sat planted like a stone altar. You had struck it with thousands of blows, watched sparks fly from it like startled birds. It never flinched, never echoed weakness. It was the one part of your world that never gave way. Until it did. You noticed it during a routine morning, one like any other. The fire was lit, the metal heating, the apprentice fetching water. You gripped the hammer, raised your arm, and brought it down hard across the half-drawn edge of a horseshoe. The sound was wrong. Just slightly. Not the usual crisp ring, but something duller. As if the earth beneath had swallowed part of the strike. You stopped, narrowed your eyes, and struck again. The anvil trembled, only slightly, but you felt it in your knees, in your ribs. A shift. A whisper of imbalance. You crouched to check its footing. There, beneath the massive base, a small gap had opened between stone and ground. The earth had sagged. Maybe from rain. Maybe from time. Maybe you thought bitterly from age, your own, or the anvil's. You tried to fix it the old way, wedging a splinter of wood beneath the edge, nudging gravel into the hollow. But it was no use. The foundation was compromised. And with every strike, the anvil moved just enough to throw your rhythm off. You missed angles. You overshot edges. The work faltered. It wasn't the anvil's fault. It was still iron. Still heavy as guilt. But it no longer rested in certainty. And neither did you. You thought about the day you first placed it there. You were young. Stronger. Proud of having inherited such a beast of metal. It had taken 4 men to move it, and you had directed them with the same voice you now saved for grumbling. Once planted, it never budged. It became the heart of the forge. You built the world around it. Now it had shifted. And you didn't know how to unshift it. You considered moving it entirely. breaking the floor, pouring a new base. But even that thought made your back ache. The apprentice offered to help, of course he did, but you waved him off. Not out of pride. Out of something deeper. If you let him move the anvil, what else would you let go next? So, for days, you worked with it crooked. Adjusted your angle. Bent your stance. Compensated. Your body learned new balance. Your muscles complained. But still, the work continued. It had to. You told yourself you'd fix it properly. When there was time. When the job slowed. When the aches stopped. But you knew you wouldn't. Not soon. Because to lift the anvil again, to dig up the past and set it down fresh, was more than a task. It was a reckoning. So you lived with it. A little wobble. A new sound. A quiet reminder that nothing stays fixed forever. Not even iron. It began as ruin often does, with a gentle sound. A few drops on the roof, soft enough to ignore. You barely noticed it at first, focused on a stubborn blade that refused to hold its edge. The wind had been strange all day, muggy, unsettled, but you'd seen worse. You thought it would pass. But it didn't. The rain came harder, and then harder still, until it wasn't a backdrop but a presence. It drummed on the roof like fists. It poured down the windows in thick lines. You paused the work, looked outside, and saw the courtyard already filling with puddles, the dirt path you'd walked every day turning to brown sludge. Still you worked. Because that's what you did. Let the sky rage, iron still needed shaping. But then the forge began to falter. You didn't see it at first. You felt it. The heat wasn't climbing right. The bellows hissed more than they roared. You looked to the coals and saw steam, not smoke. Somewhere, somehow, the storm had found its way in. You searched the rafters, the corners, the seam between the chimney and the roofstone, and there it was. Just wide enough to betray you. Just wide enough to let the storm reach down into the heart of your fire and spit on it. The coals hissed again, louder this time, and the fire stuttered. The color changed, no longer orange and angry, but pale, gasping. You tried to stoke it. You turned the bellows with urgency, with frustration, with fear. But water always wins against fire. Soon, the forge went dark. The metal on your anvil, half-shaped, sat useless and cooling, its edge lost to the temperature's betrayal. You stepped back, heart pounding, knowing full well what it meant to have the fire die in the middle of the work. Then came the worst of it. The roof groaned. A low, aching sound, like old wood remembering its limits. You looked up just in time to see a beam sag. Just an inch, but enough. Enough to send a rivulet of cold water down your back. Enough to remind you that this place, too, could fail. That everything you had built, everything you had relied on, the walls, the fire, the rhythm, was held together by things as fragile as time and dry timber. Outside, the road had become a river. You saw the apprentice running from the village, his cloak soaked and flapping like a torn sail. He shouted something, but the storm swallowed it. When he reached the door, he didn't speak. He just pointed behind him. The stream had burst its edge. The lower fields were underwater. The barn roofs vanished beneath rising gray. The village paths were gone, just mud and panic. And yet, even as floodwaters reached the forge steps, even as the air filled with the smell of wet ash and rotting wood, your eyes kept returning to the hearth. The dead hearth. The silent coals. The heart of your labor drowned without even a final crackle of protest. You stood there, soaked, cold, fists clenched around nothing. Because it wasn't just a storm. It was the day the world reminded you how easily it could take everything back. The next morning came without a knock. The forge remained quiet. Not just from the silence of the fire, still damp and sulking from the storm, but from the absence of footsteps. No farmer at the threshold with a broken hinge. No herdsman with a bent hook. No child sent with a cracked pot hook and shy eyes. Just stillness. You stood by the door longer than usual, hand resting on the frame, listening. You had never realized how much you depended on that sound. The hesitant tap, the scrape of a boot, the shuffle of someone waiting their turn. It wasn't just business. It was life. But today there was nothing. You told yourself they were busy with the flood. That their cellars had filled, their livestock scattered, their roads drowned in mud. You told yourself this was temporary, that they would return, that they still needed you. But as the hours passed, the stillness grew heavier. The apprentice arrived late. He looked tired, wet up to his knees, a thin gash across his cheek where a branch must have caught him. He didn't speak much, just took a brush to the hearthstones and began clearing what was left of yesterday's fire. His silence was respectful, but you saw something else in it too: worry, maybe even doubt. You picked up a piece of iron from the pile, even though there was no order waiting. You held it, felt its weight, ran your thumb along the cold edge. You could shape it anyway, make a tool no one had asked for. Another horseshoe, another chisel, just to stay busy, just to stay moving. But you didn't. Instead you sat, on the stool by the door. The same one you'd taken for years only after the day's last job. And you waited. By midday, still no one had come. And you began to wonder, what if they no longer needed you? What if the boy with the hammer and younger arms and quicker eyes was enough? What if the village had changed quietly while you stood at the anvil too busy to notice? What if the world had finally moved past your hands? You thought of all the tools inside, some untouched for months. You thought of the rack of nails, the rows of hinges, the blades still waiting to be sharpened. You'd built up so much, prepared for need. But now the need had vanished. Or perhaps it had never really been there. Perhaps it was just duty keeping them at your door. And now, with the flood and the road and the rot, duty had given way to distance. The apprentice asked if you wanted to close early. You shook your head, but your voice didn't follow. There was nothing left to say. Nothing left to do. Just wait. You stared at the empty road until evening. And still, no one knocked. It wasn't planned. You woke, as always, before the sun, your bones already whispering the weather. The sky outside was gray, and the ground smelled of wet soil and ash. You sat at the edge of the bed, feet on the cold stone floor, hands on your knees. The hammer was there, as it always had been, resting in its place by the hearth. But this time, you didn't reach for it. Not out of rebellion. Not even from pain. You simply didn't. The forge waited as it always did. The coals were cold, but not dead. With enough effort, you could have brought the heat back. The bellows still hung from their rig, the leather cracked in places but functional. The iron pile was untouched since yesterday, and the apprentice hadn't arrived yet. The morning was yours, and yet you just sat there, listening. Not to anything in particular, but to everything at once. The wind against the wall, the faint creak of the roof beam, the far-off caw of a raven circling something unseen. You realized, for the first time in decades, that silence could fill a room more completely than sound ever did. You didn't make tea, didn't clean your hands. You didn't even light the lantern. The forge stayed dark. You watched the light shift through the window, tracing shadows across the floor where your boots used to stand. The hammer remained where it had always been, but today it felt different. Heavier, even untouched. Heavier because it now carried the weight of choice. When the boy arrived, he hesitated at the door. You could tell he noticed the difference immediately, the absence of clamor, the quiet that wasn't restful but uncertain. He looked at the anvil, then at you, and said nothing. You didn't speak either. You only looked at him, and then at the hammer, and then back out the window. It was enough. To your surprise, he didn't press. Didn't ask what was wrong. He simply moved about the forge as if nothing had changed, sweeping, organizing, arranging iron, as though preparing for a master who had merely stepped out for a moment, not one who had paused in place. The hours passed slowly. You stayed seated, sometimes with your eyes closed, sometimes staring at the floor. Occasionally, you reached out as though to take the hammer, but always stopped short. Your hand hovered, unsure. Not from weakness, but from the strange, unfamiliar thought. What if I didn't need to pick it up again? That thought settled in your chest like dust. Not painful, not dramatic. Just present. And so, for the first time in memory, the anvil went untouched. The hammer slept through the day. The forge did not burn. And you, still breathing, sat quietly at the edge of a life built by heat and noise and began to wonder what silence might offer instead. The boy kept the place alive that day. But the fire never once asked for you. It was well past noon when the knock came. soft, uneven, more like hesitation than arrival. You weren't by the forge. Not even close. You were sitting just inside the doorway of the house, where the air was dry and the noise of the outside world seemed slightly more distant. At first, you thought you imagined it. After so many quiet days, a knock sounded like something from another life. The boy rushed to answer it, wiping his hands instinctively, as if expecting another broken hinge or bent cartwheel. But it wasn't a farmer. It wasn't a soldier. It wasn't a merchant with a blade to sharpen or a farmer's boy with a cooking hook to mend. It was an old man, thinner than a plow line, wrapped in a traveling cloak spotted with old mud and the smell of river wind. He didn't carry iron. No tools, no orders, no payment. He carried only a pouch tied with fraying rope and a look in his eyes you hadn't seen in years, calm, slow, curious. The boy asked if he needed something forged, but the old man shook his head. "I came to see the smith," he said. At that, the boy hesitated, then glanced back at you. You rose slowly, not out of obligation but curiosity. The kind that hadn't stirred in some time. "I'm not taking work today," you said, gently but plainly. The old man smiled. "I'm not offering any." You studied him. He wore no ring, no badge, no seal. Nothing to mark him a master or a messenger. But his shoes were worn from walking far, and his eyes carried a strange stillness, like someone who had seen too much to rush anymore. He asked if he could sit. You nodded, and the two of you settled near the quiet forge, the boy hovering in the background, not sure whether to stay or go. "I used to listen for the hammer," the man said after a long silence. "Even from the road. It was always ringing, always speaking. My father said your fire never slept." You said nothing, just looked at the empty hearth. He nodded toward it, slowly. "Is it tired?" You shrugged. "Maybe it's resting." The man nodded, as if that made perfect sense. "Mine did that once. Years ago. When the hands get slower and the mind gets quieter, the fire waits. Sometimes it waits a long time. Sometimes it decides not to come back." You looked at him, sharply now. "You were a smith?" "A long time ago," he said. "Now I'm just someone who remembers it." There was another pause, this one gentler. "I didn't come to ask for a blade or a nail. I came because I heard the hammer had stopped. And I wanted to see if the man behind it was still breathing." You almost smiled. Not quite. But the corners of your mouth remembered the shape. "I'm still breathing," you said. "Then you're ahead of most of us," he replied. He stayed a little longer, talking not of iron or tools, but of silence, of how work fades from the hands but never quite leaves the bones. He told you how he used to wake up reaching for a hammer that wasn't there, how he still walked past old stones and wondered how they would take a strike. And then he stood. No farewell, no thanks. Just a nod. A look that said, "You're not alone in this." When he left, the forge still stood cold. But you looked at the hammer, just once more. Not to lift it. Just to remember that it had once known you. And that someone else had too. He had watched you for years, not just at the forge, but in the quiet moments you thought were yours alone. He had seen how your shoulders settled lower each season, how your hands took longer to unclench after a long day, how your breath caught in your chest each time you bent to retrieve a drop tool. He never said anything. He never had to. Watching was enough. That morning he arrived before you did. The coals were already smoldering, kissed into life with the practiced patience you had once shown him. The bellows hung from their cords, still damp from last week's rain, but he had worked them steadily until the fire rose up with a familiar growl. The sound didn't surprise you. What surprised you was how steady it was. How clean. You stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching him work. He hadn't seen you yet. His back was straight, his rhythm sure. No hesitation. The hammer rose and fell, not with brute force, but with understanding. You knew that motion. Not the speed of a youth eager to prove himself, but the careful economy of someone who understood that fire could be coaxed, not commanded. You didn't say a word. Just stepped inside and let the warmth meet your skin. He glanced back then. Just a glance. No smile, no greeting. Just a look that said, "It's all right. I've got it." And somehow, you believed him. There was nothing dramatic about it. No ceremony. No declaration. He simply moved into the space you used to fill, picked up the hammer that once only you had held, adjusted the tongs, nudged the iron, struck again. You walked slowly to the bench by the far wall, the one with the worn grain from where you used to rest between jobs. You sat and watched. The forge glowed, the metal hissed, and the boy, no longer a boy, worked without needing to be told. He didn't ask what to do next, because he already knew. He had learned not just the weight of the tools, but the rhythm of the day, the breath of the coals, the sigh of the anvil under repeated strikes. He had learned the shape of the work, yes, but more importantly, he had learned the shape of your silence. And now he filled it. You thought about the first day he came. How small he seemed then, how soft his hands, how wide his eyes. And now here he was, shaping iron with a focus that mirrored your own from decades past. You didn't feel replaced. You didn't feel lost. You simply felt relieved. There had always been the question, what would happen after you? Would the forge go cold? Would the tools rust in peace? Would the village forget the sound of shaped iron? Now, the answer stood before you, barefoot on the stone floor, sweat on his brow, and firelight flickering in his eyes. He struck the anvil again, clean, strong, certain. And in that sound, you heard something not entirely your own. You heard the forge choosing someone new. The forge was awake before you. It had always been the other way around. You, stirring in the dark, coaxing the fire from slumber with cold fingers and careful breath. But not today. When you opened your eyes, the scent of smoke was already in the air, soft and steady, not choking or desperate, but alive. The forge didn't call to you. It didn't need to. It was no longer yours to answer. You rose slowly, not because of pain, but because there was no longer urgency. Your steps were measured, not weary. There was no need to hurry toward a rhythm that no longer depended on your hands. The sound met you before the doorway, the pulse of hammer on iron, deliberate and sure. Not rushed, not wild, just consistent, like rain on a roof or a heart beating in someone else's chest. You stood at the threshold and watched. The boy, the smith, stood tall now. He had shifted the rack of tools without asking, moved the grindstone nearer to the window, even hung the hammer on the opposite beam from where you'd kept it all these years. You might have scolded him once for such small acts. But now, you simply nodded. The fire didn't flicker when you entered. It didn't greet you or pull you forward with its usual need. It simply burned as if to say, you've done your part. You can rest now. He saw you, of course. He always did. He didn't stop his work, didn't break the rhythm. He just lifted his chin slightly, a wordless gesture that carried all the meaning in the world. You sat in your usual place, the same worn bench by the wall. But you didn't feel like a master watching a pupil. You felt like something older. A ghost that hadn't left, but no longer haunted. A memory sitting beside something new being made. The boy's strikes were clean. The iron obeyed. The forge was alive without your hands, without your voice, without your breath. And as the morning light stretched across the floor, warming the dust, you realized something quietly profound. You had become part of the forge's history. The tools would remain. The walls would stand. But your time as the keeper of flame had passed. Not with ceremony, not with sorrow, but with the slow, steady rhythm of being replaced by something that still burned. You closed your eyes, not from exhaustion, but from peace, because the fire no longer waited for you. And that, in the end, was the greatest comfort of all.